in Lansing, a conversation about stopping gun violence before it happens through red flag laws.
City leaders hosted a training session on extreme risk protection orders. News 10's Riley Connell here in studio now to explain.
Yeah, Ann and David, extreme risk protection orders are a legal mechanism for law enforcement to temporarily remove guns from someone who could be a danger to themselves or to others. They're just one part of a series of gun reform laws signed by the governor back in 2023. Earlier today, advocates, local governments, and law enforcement officials gathered downtown to talk about how extreme risk protection orders work and how to strengthen their application of that law in mid-Michigan. Statewide data shows 407 red flag orders were issued last year, resulting in about 37 people facing criminal charges. Mayor Andy Shore says he believes this law protects Lansing families from tragedy.
You now have 400 cases of this statewide. That's potentially 400 people who could be violent and do not have that gun in their hand. We certainly want to respect people's right to own and carry guns and Second Amendment, but not at the risk of others.
Now, this law is not without controversy. The red flag law was passed under a Democratic majority in the state legislature, but Republican state leaders who now hold that majority in the state house have pushed back with Second Amendment concerns. They say they are especially concerned because judges can order emergency removals which do not give the gun owner notice. Last year, Representative James DeSanta introduced 3 bills to reverse the red flag law. David, back to you.
All right, Riley, thank you. And none of those 3 bills have been reintroduced in the current legislative session.
Continuing